when we float it right, it's allowed to span additional rows because 6 and 7 then are in the next row because they've been cleared left.
OK， 所以你可以看到，刚刚上一个跟这个其实那个技巧是一模一样的，这个只是就是比较复杂一点而已。那你看1、2、4、6跟7，它就是用那个 flow left， 然后5跟3它是用那个 flow right， 然后4、5 number 4 and number 5 are the sibling row, right?
Yeah, there's a second row.
OK， 那个4跟5其实是在同一列的。OK， 所以他用这样子来看的话，你如果说他就 clear， 他用那个 clear left 在第4跟第6的话，你就会造成第5变成这么高，就会比较高。OK。
So you can play around with these rules and come out with all kinds of interesting layouts.
你在 CSS 里面的话，你可以试试看，就用这个小技巧，然后自己去玩玩看，你大概就可以把它变成就是说不一样的那个，用不同的区块来呈现你的那个内容。
Next rule I want to talk about is the absolute exception to the adjacent sibling rule. I probably should have gone over at least the rule names.
Absolute exception， 因为这个有点好笑，绝对的意外，什么叫绝对？然后这个绝对的意外是在那个兄弟姐妹的那个条件下才会发生的。
And this is simply that you can leave. You can start to lay out your site using the ordinary rules we have, so like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is all using adjacent siblings for rows and new rows. And then we get to number 6 here, and instead of floating this, we're going to position it absolutely. So position absolute, and put it at the top right of the container. When we think about the sort of the white box as the container that contains all these elements, 6 can be positioned on the top right using position absolute.
你看1、2、3、4、5，甚至于7，它这个其实就是刚刚那个技巧，没有什么特别的。但是你看看第6，它用的是叫做一个 position absolute， 它用的那个的话就是说我第6个我一定要放这里，我跟其他都无关，我其他不管怎么玩怎么动，我第6个绝对不会动，这是我一定要放的地方。
So one thing that you have to take care of is that because number 6 is positioned absolutely, it's taken completely out of the flow of the document, and other items that are floated won't be able to see this at all. So it'd be very possible to accidentally overlap something. So you need to just sort of just leave space for it, because you can't tell how tall this is. Make sure you have adequate space below that item. And of course, just so that it doesn't overlap things.
那像这样子的话，你要小心一点，就是说你那个第六区块那边呢，有时候那个大小啊，你要注意一下，要不然的话，那个2、4、7像那几个地方有没有？很可能它的那个内容会盖住到第6个区块，所以你在放东西的时候要小心点，然后你一定要记得你那个第6块的大小。
But this can be a really interesting rule to use, because you can see that it's completely broken the adjacent sibling row, because number 6 should be in this 3rd row. We've bumped it all the way up here.
这个像我们刚刚讲的那个兄弟姐妹的那个条件，就完全不适用在这里了，因为我们把第6个从5跟7中间抓出来，然后就把它拧在那一块，它就不会动。
So we actually use this on Palantir.net for the desktop layouts. You can see, if we went back, I can show you where it is, but it's using this technique.
他刚刚有给你看一个那个他们公司的那个网站，那个 Palantir.net， 在他们那个 desktop 上面的那个就是在电脑荧幕上看到的，他们就有用这个技巧。
What time is it? Okay. So I want to talk about one more rule. I've got a couple other rules, and if you're interested in the full set of rules, I did this same presentation at DrupalCon Denver. There's a video available there where you can see a couple extra rules, but they're a bit hard to explain, so I'm not going to subject my wife to trying to explain them, because I can barely explain them in English.
其实它有很多像这样子的，这些 rules 这些条件，它其实很多它可以讲。可是他说他用英文讲已经够困难了，然后再加上我要翻译，那个所以是不太适合在这里讲。但是他有一个 video， 然后他是在 DrupalCon Denver 的时候也有做这个同样的一个 talk， 所以大家可以去看。
But the rule that I'm skipping over is sort of a less useful rule anyway. But we're going to go over one last rule that is actually quite useful.
他今天会再介绍另外一个那个 rule.
And it's called the violator. Which let me give you context. You can maybe translate it a little bit better. Is that because you have a grid. Usually you're trying to line everything up to exactly match the grid, but you don't have to. When you add something that doesn't align perfectly to the grid, you create sort of visual interest, and that item will sort of jump out to your eye. And that can be quite useful if you use the violator rule. I don't know how you want to translate that judiciously.
他现在在讲的有一个 rule 叫做 violator rule， 就是反正就是你不照规矩走就对了。那你现在看的话，你就可以很清楚的发现 number 2， 第二个，他完全没有照他那个行跟列下去排，他就只是把它放在一个很不一样的地方。那这样子做的话，你对 number 2会有什么样的感觉？不合群哦，还是不合适啊？它可以吸引注意力。那最重要的那个用途，这个最重要的用途就是在这里。你那个 number 2就是会吸引到你的注意力，所以你可以把你最想要让人家看到的放在那。
Now, I talked about how CSS is our tool set. Actually, there's an additional tool that you can use, which is called Sass. Sass is what's called a CSS preprocessor, and basically it's the exact same language as CSS plus some additional language constructs which make it way easier to develop with.
有没有听过 Sass？ S-A-S。S-A-S-S。那现在的话，Sass 你可以 Sass 里面有很多CSS 的东西，然后现在用 Sass 来做那个像做 CSS 里面的一些 rule 的话，其实 Sass 比较好用，而且比较简单。那
So I recognize that when you're building responsive layouts, you have like I said, at least 3 layouts per website. That's a lot of layout CSS to handle. And layout CSS is some of the hardest CSS you can have to write. So I wrote Zen Grids, which is it's a Sass module. It's a set of predefined code written in Sass that's really easy to use and simplifies creating layouts.
你在做 responsive design 的时候，我们刚刚有讲过，你大概要做3到4个，其实那真的是很困难。如果你真的要去用 CSS 写出来的话，那所以 John 他做了一件事，就是他用 Sass 写了 Zen Grids， 它是一个 module。那你用这个的话，其实已经有很多像刚刚看的一些那个 examples， 一些那个它一些例子，它都已经先帮你写好了，所以你只要拿来用就可以了。
So we've got about 10 minutes left here, and I'm going to go to zengrids.com or try to here and show you a little bit about how this actually works.
他现在要去这个 website zengrids.com， 然后给你看一些实例。
I got internet connection. Okay. See if I can scroll with this. Can't. Oh, well. Okay. This is the them.Break website. Installing. I should first say that Sass is a development tool, which means it's not something you need to install on your web servers. It's just something you need to have on like your laptop, wherever you're developing the website. You need to have Sass installed. There's actually a great tool by a Taiwanese gentleman.
你不用把 Sass 装在那个你的电脑上面，它只是一个那个 development tool， 所以只要装在你在写 code 的地方就可以了。
This is called Fire App, and it makes it really easy. Sass and Compass are freely, Sass is freely available, but you have to use the command line to install it. This is a little application that runs on Mac or Windows or Linux, I believe, and he actually donates part of this money back to open source communities, and it means that you don't have to install all that stuff from the command line. It's sort of built into this application.
如果你不要用 command line 去装它的话，你可以用这个 Fire App。然后这个人的话，他还会把他赚到的一些钱再捐回去。
And the way Sass works basically is, I'm going to show you some sample Sass here. Yeah, if you look over here, you write a file that's written in Sass, but it just looks like CSS with a little bit of extra stuff. And then you tell like your Fire app or you tell Sass to watch the folder where you're developing all your Sass files, and it will automatically, as soon as you save the file, generate a new CSS file, a plain CSS file based on the Sass file you're writing.
你看那个 Sass 的那个 code， 其实长得很像 CSS， 或者只是 CSS 再加一些多的东西进去。那你用 Sass 写的话，你按那个 save 的时候，它其实会自己把它转换成 CSS， 把那个档案会存到一个 CSS 档案里面去。
So what this means is that of course your website and everybody just knows about the CSS files. Drupal doesn't have to know about the Sass. It just loads the CSS like normal that the Sass has generated for you.
Drupal 不晓得有 Sass 这个东西存在，所以他看到的只是从 Sass 里面转出来的那个 CSS file.
So let's see. I've got an article here which I just sort of talk about why I think that building responsive layouts, it almost requires learning Sass because it makes building your responsive layout so much easier, and there are so many other benefits to Sass that your development process just becomes so much faster with it than it does writing plain CSS without it.
他觉得一个很重要的一点就是他这个 blog 里面写的是说，如果你真的需要做 responsive design 的话，你几乎是一定要学 Sass， 因为这个会帮助你很多，会帮你省很多时间。
So let me show you an example. here's our example markup here. We've got a container, which is just a div, and then we just have some items here that are articles using HTML5 article tag, sides, footer tag. It's pretty basic HTML markup.
这个只是一个非常简单的那个 HTML5 的一些那个 terms。
And this is the complete example of all the Sass that you need to write in order to create a responsive layout for this.
然后你刚刚看到的啊，它这个全部就这么几行而已，用 Sass 写出来就可以了。你这样子的话，你就可以做一个 responsive layout 了。
So the first thing you need to do is just say @import Zen, which basically says I'm going to use Zen grids, so include all of that code that it needs.
第一行他写 import Zen， 就是跟他们讲说我要用 Zen grids， 我把所有里面 Zen grids 里面的东西放进来。
And then I've decided that I want to use 7 columns as my grid. So I'm going to have sort of 7 vertical. Let me show you an example here. I'm going to have 7 columns in my layout. So in order to tell Zen grids that, I just set this variable. This is one of the things that Sass adds to CSS, the ability to set variables. So we're going to set this variable to say 7. Zen column count 7.
这个地方 Zen column count 7， 就是他刚刚有给你看一个图，你就是设了7行这样子。
And then we're going to set the gutter width. This is the space in between the columns. I'm going to set it to 10 pixels.
那个 gutter width 就是那个第2行那个地方呢，它那个是2个 column 2行之间的那个空隙，它现在设的是10，就是10个 pixel。
And then you remember we had that container element. We have to add a Zen grid container mix-in. Basically, when you say @include something, that says apply this predefined set of CSS to this element. So basically, it's going to add in a couple lines of CSS to this container selector. And the reason why it needs it, like, if all the elements are floated, you need to. If all the items are floated, your container needs to contain them, and of course, floats naturally flow outside of their container. So you need to add like a clear fix. So that's one of the things that the Zen grid container mix-in adds to. When it's applied.
这个有点难解释。你在一个荧幕上，然后我们刚刚看到有那种它的区块有没有？那我们不是都用 float 吗？那其实 float 的话，它简直是漂浮的嘛。那如果说你没有把它们用一个盒子、用一个框框把它装进来，它们这样子漂浮，其实会飘出去的。那他现在做的这个 include Zen grid container， 就等于是说你要设定说它的那个框框是多大，然后它里面有一些就是已经设定好的一些那个 variable 在里头。
Yeah. So this is one of the powerful things about Sass is that with a single line of code, of Sass code, we're applying all the CSS that this mix-in adds to it. So we've written one line of code and we sort of get at the output in the CSS file, there can be as many lines of CSS as that mix-in defines.
那个你看，在 Sass 里面这只是1行而已，可是它如果说它把这个转成 CSS 的话，其实是很多很多行的，因为它这样写了1行，它里面所有的东西在那个 Zen grid container 里面，还有那里面的东西，全部都会被那个转成 CSS， 所以它转出来的东西其实是非常非常多的。
And so for every single grid item in our container, we're going to apply this special Zen grid item mix-in to each item.
所以你就可以这样子做啊，你每一个特别的东西的话，每一个你有那个我们刚刚看到 item 1、item 2那样子，你就可以这样子写，在 Sass 里面就这样写。那你看到 Sass 的好处就是这里，你只要写1行，其实转出来的东西是很多的。
And the syntax that I wrote for Zen grid item is really easy. I've got this content item that I want to position in our grid. So I'm going to tell it that I want this item to span 4 columns and start in the 3rd column of our grid. Here I've numbered the grid columns from left to right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So literally I want my content to span 4 items and start in this 3rd column. So in order to generate all the CSS I need for the content, I just need this single line of code.
它那边写4跟3有没有？它的意思就是说，它需要它的那个内容要放在4行里面，然后从第3行开始，要放在4行里面，3、4、5、6就放在4行里面，然后从第3行开始。
And that's exactly the same thing, same technique that I used for the other ones. Aside 2, I want it to just be 1 column wide, but start in the 7th column. So it's way over here.
像刚刚写那个1，然后 comma 7，就是我的内容我只要放在1行里面，然后我从第7行开始，所以就变成了在最右边那边，在1行里面从第7行开始。
Yeah. And if I want to start a new row, then I just add a Zen clear mix-in.
然后你用那个 Zen clear， 它就会到新的一列，你就加了一列进去。
And so basically with just this little bit of code that's right here, which is what, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, it's like 15 lines of code, and we've got our entire layout.
这样15行的 Sass， 你这样子的 layout 就出来了。
So as you're writing the Sass, you can start to play around with things because it's so easy to write. You can start to visualize it in your head as you're writing the Sass code without having to worry about the messiness of the CSS that's underneath it. Because writing that CSS is really complicated that it generates. But you don't have to know about any of that complication. You just have to know where you want to put the items. So it becomes way easier to develop layouts.
Sass 会是一个比较简单的那个工具，让你来写这么复杂的 CSS。因为如果你要用 CSS 写这个的话，其实真的是很多很多。
So there's some additional things that you can learn about Zen grids, and you just got to reference document with all the help and stuff. But you know, I've taught you all the basics already, so you just need to learn a couple other things.
这个其实是一个很基础的一个就是最基础最简单的那个 Sass。那你用这个来写的话，其实你就已经知道说所有的那个 Zen grids 需要知道的地方。
So that's basically it. Thank you very much. 谢谢。Are there any questions? I know it's really hard. I know it's really hard to get Chinese people to ask questions, but I would really like some.
And then it's not Chinese who ask questions.
I traveled all the way just to ask this question. So between Sass and less CSS, why Sass instead of less? Is less inferior or below the quality of maturity, or Sass is really much better in terms of mobile?
So the question was, why did I choose to develop Zen grids using Sass versus less? Less is another CSS preprocessor, but it's very similar to Sass, but it's different, right? So they're not exactly equally compatible. You can't write less and just have it work in Sass. They're incompatible, slightly different. And the reason why I chose Sass is actually quite simple.
他的问题是说，为什么 John 没有用 less 去写？为什么他选 Sass？Less 跟 Sass 其实很相近，是两个都是这样来做 CSS 用的，可是他们两个并不是不相容。然后它的原因是
And the reason is that Less has decided that it wants to be a very CSS-like language. Whereas Sass decided that they're going to add in a lot of programming technologies like for loops and if loops. And for 99.9995% of front-end developers, they don't care about those extra features that are in Sass. But that small percentage of Sass developers who need that functionality then can write really incredible Sass modules that anybody can use. So because Sass is more capable, you're going to end up with much more awesome, freely available, modules that do cool stuff for you. So why should you pick Sass? Is because I can write really cool things using
It's
it.
more flexible than less.
less 跟 CSS 其实很像。然后 Sass 的话，因为有很多像他们这种 developer， 他们可以用 Sass 做出很多比较更好的 module 出来给大家用，所以他选 Sass， 他没有选 less。因为它可以用 Sass 写出像这种 predefined 的已经做好的东西，像 Zen-Grids 这种东西，然后大家都可以用，所以他觉得 Sass 比较好。
It would literally be impossible for me to write Zen-Grids using less.
那个 Zen-Grids 不可能出现生出来，如果他要用 less 来写的话。
Thank you.
Any other questions? By Chinese person? Yes, great.
第一个问题是从我们菲律宾来的朋友问的，他终于找到一个台湾人要问问题。
Excuse me. We have different browser, Firefox, Safari. So we to test so many browsers, even using Sass. Am I right?
Well, because a Sass file gets converted into plain CSS, any browser can understand the CSS. One of the nice things about Sass, and there's I've been talking about Sass, but I haven't mentioned Compass. Compass is basically a library of predefined Sass modules. So there's a bunch of like CSS3 stuff, and there's actually a module specifically dealing with IE legacy software. So they have a couple of variables that provide sort of generic IE support to any module that you write in Sass. And Zen-Grids uses those same variables. So you basically, if you want, you can turn on or off IE 6, 7, and 8 support. There's just like a simple variable that you have to set and say, yes, I want it, or false, I don't want it. And it'll make sure the right CSS is inside the generated file to support those browsers.
Thank you.
刚刚的问题是问到说，如果你有很多不同的那个browsers， 像 IE 啊、Firefox、Mozilla， 你这个 Sass 有没有办法 support？ 其实都可以。
So I wrote Zen-Grids basically starting last December and came out this spring. But the CSS behind it is the CSS that's been in the Zen theme since the very beginning. So the CSS technique is cross-browser and is it's literally been deployed on hundreds of thousands of websites. It's very solid.
那个他从去年12月吧开始用 Sass， 就是写 Zen-Grids， 然后今年春天的时候 Zen-Grids 出来。那可是它里面的那些 CSS 啊，其实已经用了很久了，然后都是在 Zen theme 里面，所以现在的话